Hello, it's your friend Phil, project management trainer and coach. Today I'm talking to you about project promises and the project management plan. Both go hand in hand. Typically, there's a promise before there's a plan. But that doesn't mean that the promise is more important than the plan. The plan is more important than the promise, because without the plan you cannot deliver the promise. Both go hand in hand, but the plan should supersede the promise. So when you are getting ready to promise a client, a stakeholder, a manager, a deliverable, have at the back of your mind you need to do some solid front end planning. Now, there's a reason why it's called front-end planning, because you do it on the front end, not back-end planning or mid-range planning. You want to plan up front, because failure to plan up front could put you into a tailspin that at the end of the day will knock all the blocks of the project off the wall, and there you'll be in the midst of disarray and confusion and yelling stakeholders. That's not what we want to happen. We want to plan up front so that we deliver a solid promise to our customers. Professor Ed Gibson of ASU, one of my friends on LinkedIn, has done some really great work for CII, the Construction Industry Institute, and we'll be taking a look at some of the work that Professor Gibson did with a group from CII later on. But let's take a look at this quote from him. Typically, a project will not be better than its front-end planning process. Now that's a loaded statement. It's not about the deliverable. It's not about the product, service, or result that you're working on. What makes that product, service, or result a great deliverable, a great delivery, a great transition is the front-end planning process. Now, the term front-end planning is known to be more used in construction. People call it front-end loading in some other industries. People just call it planning. But I like the word front-end planning because a lot of PMs are reactive and they find themselves trying to react in executing, actually carrying out planning in the middle of executing. I'm not talking about adjusting the plan. I'm talking about they just start the project anyhow and they don't really do a thorough job until in the middle of executing. When it starts going wrong, that's when they begin to plan in earnest. And that's not how it should be done. It should be done on the front end. Now, in order to illustrate this for you, we'll talk about the law of navigation from John C. Maxwell's 21 Irrefutable Laws of Leadership. By the way, that's a great leadership book. I would recommend it to anyone in project management, in leadership. Anyone who wants to be a great leader should read that book. But let's talk about the law of navigation. John says, anyone can steer the ship, but it takes a leader to chart the course. And this is one of my favorite laws in this book. It's one of my favorite laws because it relates back to planning, which is a key component of project management. Take a look in the PMBOK guide, the Project Management Body of Knowledge Guide, which is the standard for project management from the PMI. Take a look at any of the editions of the PMBOK guide from 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th. What you realize is almost half of the processes in every PMBOK guide are in planning. Half of the processes, for example, in the 5th edition, you've got 47 processes. 24 of those processes are from planning. What does that tell you? It tells you that planning is very important in project management. Planning is big. In fact, everything else you do in project management rests on planning. So when you think about planning, think about it as making sure that your client has a solid deliverable, has a solid experience at the end. You don't want your clients to say, well, ultimately, after a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, after planning ad hoc, you finally managed to pull it off. No, no, no. You want the experience to be good. Similar to the experience that I'll talk about of Roald Amundsen's team, who was an explorer who ventured to the South Pole. But there was another fellow, Robert Falcon Scott, who had a totally opposite experience. And we're going to take a look at these two experiences, and I'll show you why planning is so important. John Maxwell's law of navigation from the 21 irrefutable laws of leadership states that anyone can steer the ship, but it takes a leader to chart the course. Before leaders go on a journey, they go through a process in order to give the trip the best chance of being a success. That's exactly how project management is. We call it lessons learned. But in the world of project management, we should take those lessons learned and plan them in to our future projects or our current projects to avoid failures that we made yesterday. This law is really good because planning is so important in project management. Navigators draw on past experience. Navigators examine conditions, just like project managers should. Navigators listen to what others have to say, just like what project managers should. But let's go into the story. The story starts off on a story of two trips, two missions. Who's the first to reach the South Pole? Roald Amundsen was the first explorer in the story, and he planned to get to the North Pole first, but he was beaten by Robert Peary, and he decided, well, let me tackle the South Pole. He painstakingly planned the trip. He carried out a lot of groundwork, studied the Eskimos, decided to transport supplies by dog sled, and he also decided to take along expert skiers and dog handlers. He had everything planned out and mapped out. He planned daily rest prior to next day travel. He had everything planned to a T. The worst problem was a fellow who had an infected tooth. And ultimately, he got to the South Pole. There's the photo with Roald Amundsen and his team looking at the Norwegian flag. Now, on the flip side, when you compare the story of Robert Falcon Scott, it isn't as clear-cut and as happy as the story of Roald Amundsen. Robert Falcon Scott used motorized sledges and ponies, and the motors gave up 5 days after the trip. The ponies did terrible in that frigid temperature. The poor things had to be killed. Team members ended up hauling the sledges. He had very little or no attention to detail. Poor clothes led to frostbite. It was a total disaster. They were always low on food, always low on water, always low on supplies. They had very poorly marked depots, so on the way back it was hard for them to even find the food and the supplies that they had left. I mean, everyone became dehydrated. They took a fifth man even though the supplies were only for 4. Now they eventually arrived at the South Pole. There's the crew, the team, and unfortunately that was the last expedition of Robert Falcon Scott, the British naval officer. Peter F. Drucker said, "Unless commitment is made, there are only promises and hopes, but no plans." Promises and hopes, but no plans. They eventually got there, but let's talk about what happened on the trek back. It was worse than the trek up. They were afflicted by scurvy. They ran out of food supplies. Lawrence Oates, one of the fellows who followed him up there, had frostbite so severe he couldn't do anything. He walked out into a blizzard and said he just needed a bit of time and felt he was a weight to the group. He walked out and never came back. And 2 months later, still 150 miles from their base camp, they died one by one. Very unfortunate. And they updated their diaries, but just shows you an example of a PM who was unable to lead by the law of navigation. very poor planning, and followers really need someone to lead them effectively. They need a project manager. I mean, we call it a project manager, but look at any walk in life. If you do not plan effectively, you're setting yourself up for failure. Leaders do even more than control the direction. They plan up front. They plan on how to get to the destination. They know who they need to succeed, what they need to do to succeed, and they go all the way to succeed by thorough planning. Not brute force, but solid front-end planning. When you take a look at the qualities of these navigators, you'll see that they draw on past experience, and from success they know what they should do and what they shouldn't do. They learn from failures. They take time to reflect. They look inward and outward. They pay close attention to current conditions, and they count the cost. They gather a lot of information from different sources. It reminds me of project management in the PMBOK guide, how it's advised. Think about all the different perspectives: time, cost, scope, risk, HR communications, stakeholder management, procurement, you name it. You've got all your bases covered. You see, that's why planning is important. You're trying to cover your bases. You're trying to make sure that every single avenue for failure has been thought of and has been accounted for. You're making sure that you're going to succeed no matter what. At the end of thorough front-end planning, you become positive that you can take your people all the way. People need a project manager that is serious and one who knows that he or she can take the team all the way till the end. Take a look at Amundsen. He studied Native Americans, looked into warm clothes, survival strategies, saw the facts realistically, and prepared well. On the other hand, Robert Falcon Scott did not do the same. So what are we trying to say in all of this story? The bottom line is they are big picture people and they are process and detail people. And in order to succeed, you need both. The PM must take that big picture, that big vision, and must very, very painstakingly plan how to execute the vision. That's the beauty of project managers. Project managers need to be process and detail people. And if you are a big picture person, it is very important to develop a team around you that complements you, because it's all about planning ahead, step by step. The best leaders manage well. We're talking about finding someone to manage the process. Now, you might be the visionary, but great leadership is understanding that you are just a great visionary who needs a great supportive team to look into the detail. Doing the right thing today to reach your destination tomorrow is what front-end planning is. If you don't manage the day correctly, you won't succeed in the long run. The law of navigation is a key law. The question is not doing every law with excellence, but knowing when to hand the ball off, knowing when your skills are limited in front-end planning, in planning in general. So get someone to help you. Let's work together to get to the desired goal. Project managers, a lot of dependency is on you to be a great front-end planner, to be the detail person. Lots of projects fail because we've got the wrong people managing projects, the wrong people managing portfolios. If you're a detail person, you want to be right there in the nitty-gritty of the project. You're a visionary type person, you want to be on that portfolio level. And you need to know when to hand the ball off. We need to be able to identify people who can get us to our goal. The goal that your customer sets is really a promise that you make. You say, I know what your goal is. I promise I'll deliver your deliverable to meet that goal. That's really what a promise is. A promise is a declaration or assurance that one will do a particular thing, or that guarantees that a particular thing will happen. So when you as the PM step up to the plate, or you're shoved onto the plate, right, to manage a particular endeavor, just know it's been looked at as a promise, whether you like it or not, whether you argue it, whether you say, oh, I didn't volunteer for this or not. The moment you're the PM, it's a promise that you're making to deliver value, quality, on time, on budget, and so on, within scope. A promise assures someone that one will definitely do, give, or arrange something, undertake, or declare that something will happen. So project managers, it's a tall order that you've got to deliver based on all that we've seen in what a promise is. It's all about delivering the promise. But who are the parties in a promise? The parties in a promise are the stakeholders and the team should help you develop that front-end plan. So let's talk about front-end planning here. Front-end planning is aimed at defining project objectives, defining project scope in detail. Working smart early and doing the heavy lifting up front is what front-end planning is all about. Developing that roadmap for the whole project, providing a basis for executing, monitoring, controlling, and closing the project. Not doing it ad hoc, but having a basis for managing all areas of the project. There are other aliases of front-end planning. For example, some people say advanced planning in infrastructure. We call it front-end loading in the industrial world, and we've got other terms such as schematic design or design development or conceptual engineering or programming or pre-project planning. Whatever you care to call front-end planning, planning is important, and it should come first before you attempt to deliver the promise. Now let's progress further to talk about planning in the world of the PMI, documented in the Project Management Body of Knowledge Guide. Let's take a look at the PMBOK planning approach. When you think about planning in the world of the PMBOK Guide, it is spread across various areas. We call them knowledge areas. And these areas are simply different facets that we need to plan for on any project, either in detail or at a high level, depending on the project and the people on the project. For example, if you're working on a short-term project and there are 2 people on the project, the degree of planning may be less than a project which has 50 people or 100 people or 1,000 people. So in the world of planning in the PMBOK Guide, we have to plan for all these dimensions. We think about scope management. What is in the project and what is not in the project? What does the project consist of? Where do we draw the line? We call that scope management. We also need to talk about the schedule. How long will each activity or task on the project take? And ultimately, how long will the schedule take? That needs to be planned. We call that schedule management. We also need a plan for cost. What is the budget going to be? What are the estimates for each scheduled activity or task going to be? So that's the triple whammy, I call it. That's the iron triangle of time, cost, and scope. And it should be planned as far as what exactly are we going to do to define the scope? And what is the scope? And what are we going to do to define the schedule? And what is the schedule? Finally, now that we've gone through all of the estimates of activity duration and activity resources, and we've defined the activities, what exactly is our schedule going to look like? And then we go into cost management, which is how are we going to plan cost? And what is the budget? And what is the time-phased budget at completion, spread across the project duration? Those are things that need to be defined when you're planning. In addition to that, in the PMBOK, we also need to identify quality standards that need to be met, and we need to have a plan for how to meet those standards. We also need to think about human resources. We need to think about people. Now, the PMBOK doesn't go into the details of what it really means to manage resources in the broader sense of people, equipment, and material. There's a lot of focus on the human resource management aspect, but resource management cuts across various areas of human, equipment, and material. When you're planning, be it a construction project, be it something in production, you should plan for resources. How will resources be acquired? How will they be managed? And if they're human resources, how will they be developed? Also, in the world of planning, you need to think about communications management. How are we going to communicate? What are the requirements for communication? How often are we going to communicate? And so on. You also need to be thinking about risk management. What are the things that could possibly go wrong on the project? And how are we going to prevent those things or manage those things if they happen? Also, in the PMBOK guide is the procurement management knowledge area. And procurement management, as far as planning is concerned, is aimed at defining which contract types are we likely to use based on what we need to acquire from outside the organization. How are we going to go about the procurement process and so on. And lastly, stakeholder management. We need to plan for our stakeholders, how our stakeholders will be managed, how their needs, their wants, their expectations will be constantly met, and how they will be kept engaged on the project through meeting their expectations. Because believe me, stakeholders get very quickly disengaged if their needs and wants are not being managed. So when you look at the big picture, planning is so important. So important that we've got these 10 dimensions of project management that need to be planned. Scope, schedule, cost, quality, resources, communications, risk, procurement, stakeholders. It's important. Now, some projects people get away by not adequately planning every area. But other projects, you can't fluff it. You have to plan everything. You have to plan it to a T. And that's why Agile has its place and predictive life cycles have their place. Fully plan-driven life cycles have their place. So planning should not be trifled with. This is a very important area. There's several subsidiary plans and project baselines that are developed in the planning process group. If you take a look here, this is a list of some of the plans that exist in the big project management plan. So when you hear the term project management plan, it's not talking about one linear plan. It's talking about a multi-dimensional plan which caters to all of the different things we talked about. So the project management plan contains change management plan, communications management plan, configuration management plan, and you can read the rest. That is really what a project management plan is. We go into other details like the WBS and the WBS dictionary as being part of the scope baseline. And we talk about the cost baseline, the cost performance baseline, which is your time-phased budget at completion. There's a lot of stuff in this area, but I'm only trying to let you see the importance of planning and what planning could entail, taking a look at it from the right perspective. You might have heard about the Standish Group. This is a really dated presentation from the world of the Standish Group back in the 90s, mid-90s, 94 to be precise. And in this survey that they carried out from 2,500 personnel attending project management training, from the surveys from the IT project arena, they discovered that out of all projects, the major reason, the leading reason why projects fail, why programs also fail, is poor organization and project management practices. But going a step further, you can see that ineffective planning was at the head of the other reasons, such as technical problems, problems with suppliers, insufficient project personnel resources, which you would have thought would be higher, and then ineffective project planning. Now, poorly defined or missing project objectives, also a big one, but I attribute that to ineffective planning. Because if you're not able to effectively define scope, you're not effectively able to define project objectives, you're not doing a good job in planning. So let's as well combine the 20% and the 15%, and let's just say 35% of the reasons for failure of projects comes from poor planning. People will say, well, that was back in the 90s. It hasn't changed much. It has not changed much. Leading causes for failure on projects, poor organization and project management practices to start with, and ineffective planning. Because if you plan well, you'll catch all these misalignments in the beginning. So, most organizations now recognize that poor project management practices ensure project failure. If you want to fail, just don't plan. Just don't have good project management practices. A project has a better chance of success with a competent and experienced project manager at the helm. Why? Because hopefully they understand the importance of front-end planning. Certifications such as the Project Management Professional and a few others are a good measure of a project manager's understanding of core project management practices, and that's why a lot of organizations are requiring it. So project management training is not a bad thing. It's a good thing. Project management certifications are a good thing. Delivering the promise through solid front-end planning, it's hard work, but the results are energizing. In the words of Churchill, let our advanced worrying become advanced thinking and planning. If you want to succeed, just plan. If you want to fail, don't plan. George S. Patton said, a good plan today is better than a perfect plan tomorrow. Going into the world of CII, Construction Industry Institute, a quote from them: front-end planning in the world of CII states the essential process of developing sufficient strategic information with which owners can address risk and make decisions to commit resources in order to maximize the potential for a successful project. Simply put, front-end planning is performing the right project, scoping the right things for a good design basis, and setting the stage for successful execution. As I said in the beginning, a lot of this work was done by Professor Ed Gibson of ASU, and those are the links to his profile on ASU and also his profile on the CII website. CII is an organization in which the membership consists of 100 leading owners, contractors, and suppliers, and their mission is to improve cost effectiveness of capital project life cycles. Over the years, CII has carried out lots of research in construction management. 200 interviews, 38 case studies, 23 workshops, workshop participants totaling up to 327, 375 questionnaires to companies, and 5 PhDs and 14 master's students took part in various front-end planning research. 20 case studies and $1.9 billion worth of project and 70 questionnaires. I mean, the list just goes on and on. So this is some really interesting research effort that has been put into this. Well, the big question is, what does it take to do good front-end planning, and is there any difference between projects with good and bad front-end planning? From the sample of 609 projects worth $35 billion, there were 23 questions that were asked about these projects completed in terms of front-end planning. An index was assigned to each project in the database based on the answers to these questions, and they were categorized with those above the mean being well defined, those below the mean being poorly defined. It's a rather direct approach, but it still shed some light on what front-end planning entailed and what the benefit of it was. So the bottom line of the survey and the work conducted illustrated that out of the sample of 609 projects worth over $35 billion, the results of good front-end planning was projects that had good front-end planning cost 10% less in terms of schedule, they had a 7% shorter delivery, and in terms of changes, there were 5% fewer changes in projects that had good front-end planning. So good front-end planning overall translates into better results. Predictability of cost and schedule performance is also big, and the reduction of changes and reduction of schedule are also prominent when there's good front-end planning. John Fish, one of my friends from CII, shared some of these slides with me, and this one I'm showing you right here shows you that at point 3, that's your final chance to get the plan right. You have a period where you define, but the moment you leave the definition phase, where you begin to execute, where you begin to go into the detailed engineering and the procurement and the construction, or in the world of IT, where you actually begin to do the programming and the implementation and so on, by the time you have left that gate, that's it. It goes downhill from there. The ability to influence cost, the ability to ensure that there are any changes, is highest at the beginning of the project. But as you taper towards the end of the project, you have less of a cost influence. As time progresses, as you move to the right of the screen, your ability to influence cost greatly diminishes. In the world of the PMI, they also have in the PMBOK guide 5th edition or even the 4th edition, you see that the influence of stakeholders is highest at the beginning, tapers off as the project goes to an end. Why? Because you've spent so much money that having to replan and do things differently, do things all over again, costs more money. Take a look at the cost of changes. The cost of changes are low at the beginning. Now's the time to change if you want to. But if you don't change and you keep moving along the continuum of time, you find out that the cost of changes skyrockets. And that's why front-end planning is important. You want to catch anything that is dangerous to the project, harmful to the project while you are planning. You want to think of all the possibilities of failure and nip those in the bud. You want to make sure everything's well planned. So that's really what front-end planning is all about. Edison says, good fortune is what happens when opportunity meets with planning. People say, oh, you were lucky. Oh, you're lucky your project succeeded. No, you weren't. You simply ensured that opportunity met with planning. So what does the PM need to do to deliver the promise? To deliver the promise that was chartered at the beginning of the project manager should weigh the opportunity and present to boards of stakeholders or the board of directors, whoever is going to sanction and bless the opportunity needs to be made aware of the feasibility through a multidimensional feasibility study of time, cost, scope, and technology, and the whole 9 yards of the feasibility study. A go or no go decision should be made by involving the project team and everyone else, and at that point, when you decide to go ahead, you charter the project and seal the promise. And then after that, you get involved in stakeholder identification, thorough front-end planning by sucking in those stakeholders to the planning, and ultimately you go through the PDCA cycle. You plan, do, check, and act. But delivering the promise ultimately doesn't come without all the previous steps being well carried out. So you want to deliver the promise, but you want to do it with solid front-end planning. See, project management is the art and science of managing projects to deliver promises made to management, promises made to customers, end users, and other stakeholders. It involves applying skills and knowledge to projects in an orderly way to manage them more successfully. The core component in project management is one of planning. Like it or not, great project management establishes control on the front end. And people very often don't like control. That's why the project managers get kicked out of offices when they ask for people to be involved in planning, or they ask for resources to be involved in planning. And a lot of management people on management, they tell them, what a waste of time, just get the work done, instead of taking a few steps back, looking at what's at hand and planning. So ultimately, you want to deliver the promise with great project management. And that concludes our quick review of project promises and the project management plan, chapter 1. It's from a much wider presentation that I have cut down and tailored specifically to the planning process group and front-end planning. Take care. Speak to you soon.